The motion this House believes the government should actively prevent gentrification to be called upon the first speaker of the USA to open proposition space.
Is a 69-year-old woman living in a rapidly gentrifying area of West Oakland, California. When she's successfully evicted from her house of 47 years, her first stop would likely be a relative's couch. After that, she doesn't know. She now has to wonder where she will live, work, and raise her family. And as a team comprised of members who see gentrification every day in our home cities, we're incredibly proud to propose the motion. This House believes that government should actively prevent gentrification. Two things to chat about in this speech. First, a few notes on framing before delivering our first two substantive arguments. But first, framing. What does gentrification look like? We believe that gentrification is the rapid influx of a significant amount of affluent people and businesses into a neighborhood that has historically been low income. On proposition, we specifically oppose the pace of this migration. What then is our model? We are going to prevent gentrification, meaning that we support policies that address the root cause so that it never occurs. Two things that we'd likely support. First, we will end government policies that promote gentrification, so no building high-end housing to attract wealthy young people, and banning policies like eminent domain that remove long-term residents to make space for new residents. Second, we are going to freeze property taxes and place rent caps in gentrifying areas in the event that gentrification raises those prices radically. Lastly, what is our stance? We do not oppose all economic investment in gentrifying communities. We support it whenever it's designed to benefit the existing residents rather than attract affluent people. For example, this looks like tax credits for existing businesses over new outside ones, improving basic utility and infrastructure over creating luxury buildings, and requiring new businesses to employ existing residents in the event that they do. That being said, let's move on to our first substantive argument about how gentrification creates economic harm. The thesis of this argument is that gentrification brings displacement, forcing the most vulnerable citizens out of their homes. This happens in two ways. First, through rising rents. The influx of new residents in a gentrifying area creates an increased demand for the existing supply of housing. Landlords want to capitalize on this increased demand, and so they raise rents. As rents go up, people who cannot afford them are driven out, replaced by wealthier individuals who are willing to pay the higher prices. For example, Lisbon in Portugal is rapidly gentrifying. This happened after the government attracted foreign investors and converted historic neighborhoods into housing for young professionals. Over the past year alone, rents have risen by 23%. The second way that displacement occurs is through increasing the cost of living. As people move into a gentrifying area, the cost of living increases because new businesses will cater to those customers who will pay the higher prices. Even if you have access to affordable housing, people will still be displaced because they can no longer afford to live in their communities. All of this is empirically confirmed. Over a 22-year period in the US, displacement was 2 times higher in gentrifying areas than it was in non-gentrifying ones. But why does gentrification matter? Why does displacement matter? Two broad reasons. First, displacement imposes severe costs on individuals. It's difficult to find a place to live because some individuals, if they already live in economic areas that aren't super stimulated, don't have the money for things like a security deposit if they want to start renting a new place. Also, children of these families are included, having to move to new school districts that probably won't be able to service their needs. And you see things like maybe a lack of public transportation in the new areas these individuals live in. So whereas before, your walk to work may have been like 5 minutes, now you probably have to take a bus that is over an hour long. Displacement compounds all of the harms that economically disadvantaged people already must face. But our model uniquely addresses this. By ending active government support, we slow down the pace of migration. It is this influx that causes a supply crunch that increases rents and cost of living. Even if some people move in, without active government support, that migration is much smaller, so it does not carry the same harms. The second broad impact of displacement is that it undermines local businesses. Local businesses are only able to sustain themselves through a loyal consumer base because they may not be able to do things like aggressively advertise. Displacement takes away this base, but this is so important because the big businesses that replace them are are unable to help the community in the same way because local businesses reinvest in those communities. For example, the excess profits that come from my bodega go back into that neighborhood, but the excess profits from Starbucks simply make Howard Schultz richer. We ensure on our side that people both have access to homes and local businesses that are crucial for facilitating economic self-sufficiency. Our second substantive argument is on the government obligation to prevent gentrification. Before I get onto that, go ahead.
Do property prices go down significantly in areas that are subject to your team's policies?
I don't think that property values go down significantly, rather they stay what they were at the start of gentrification, and as time goes on and these neighborhoods get developed with this public housing, we believe that the property values will rise, but slowly. On your side of the house, gentrification happens at exponential rates, where these individuals come into these areas and significantly bring up the prices and cause displacement because no one can adjust to the long term to those issues. Our second substantive argument is on the government obligation to prevent gentrification. There are two sources of this obligation. The first is that individuals have a positive right to home. The home is the basis of all other rights. Without a home, you don't have a place to provide shelter or the most basic sense of well-being. That is why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that housing is a human right. Note that this is not just a shelter over someone's head. The right to a home also extends to things like geographic stability. Why is this the case? Because people's development, identities, and self-actualization are tied to the culture, community, and location that they call home. Thus, the destruction of these ties through displacement creates deep material and psychological harm. The government has the obligation to protect people from the forced abandonment of their communities and culture. This is why individuals who are displaced can't simply pick up and move. People's life experiences and future plans shouldn't be disposable for affluent young professionals. The second source of this obligation is the idea that people have a negative right to property. People have a right to property free from the state's interference. That is because this is the sphere of citizens' lives that gives them meaning and allows them to exercise freedom. If we prove that gentrification is the result of government action, then it's akin to a government-imposed violation of people's rights to property, i.e. a state-sponsored eviction. How does gentrification inherently require ongoing government support to exist? Two ways. First, the private market only exists because of implicit government supports. Investors don't want to invest in poor neighborhoods because they're worried that they can never get a return. So only government policies like quote-unquote economic development programs like tax credits for new businesses over tax credits for the poor and elderly can give them that assurance. That means government action is a necessary prerequisite for gentrification to occur. The second way this happens is that governments directly kick out residents for gentrification. They resort to policies like eminent domain, which means seizing people's property, knocking down their homes, and building commercial real estate. For example, the Lagos government of Nigeria used eminent domain to displace 10,000 people from the neighborhood of Morocco for quote-unquote civilized development. At the end of the day, this debate is extremely clear. Gentrification harms the most vulnerable populations. Government intervention is more than necessary. It is absolutely required. We are incredibly proud to propose.
I'd like to thank that speaker and call on the first opposition speaker to open their case.
Gdansk, Poland, was considered a drug-riddled slum area for years, to the point where City Hall had basically abandoned it. It ended up being gentrification, young professionals moving in and petitioning for change that restored it to its former glory. Under Team USA's side, Gdansk inner city would still be in a state of permanent disrepair and its inhabitants would still be living in degradation. A 4-point stats for you today. 1. Our view of gentrification that it is an effective way of getting investment in private areas. 2. On Team Scotland, we don't have to defend things like forced eviction or like intimating tenants or co-tenants, right? Because these things probably happen outside of gentrified communities anyway. 3. We do still support measures that mitigate the negative consequences of gentrification. Things like rehousing displaced people rather than trying to prevent gentrification outright. 4. We know that Team USA cannot win by listing negative effects of gentrification. They need to explain why these outweigh the positive impact that gentrification brings, and they need to convince us that state intervention won't cause unnecessary additional harms. If they cannot do this, they cannot win. Having said this, the case we're bringing today consists of 3 points: the harms of active prevention, the harms to residents in the private areas, and in second, we'll bring in segregation facilities. But before we get into substantive, let's look at what we've heard from TBSA so far. First thing in their methods, they told us they prefer investment designed to improve areas rather than invested through gentrification. We think this is pretty unrealistic because state governments just can't do this. There's budget constraints, which means they're more likely to spend money because they get faster returns than spending on low-income residential areas. Second, I think government incentives usually are to spend for in low-income areas or for in minority ethnic areas. We just don't think this happens, which means you have to have gentrification for any investment to take place. This is tied into my second argument. But then we've got this bigger idea of displacement. We told us with gentrification you get more demand, increased rent, and cost of living. Point. A few responses. So first, we think it's probably gentrifiers that will have a demand for a different type of housing than existing residents. Because the point to which TBSA tells us that gentrifiers are professionals or businesses, we think they've got a different demand than working families that already live there in terms of what they're looking for with rent. In any case, we'll weigh this more explicitly with homeowners that we'll review later in our case. Then we got told about the cost of living increase. Because actually gentrifiers probably bring money for existing businesses, and which money then gets reinvested in the community, or we support businesses whichever we can use. Again, more of that later. We then got told about how people move out. Again, we can support rehousing people. We can support finding alternative housing. I don't think that's necessarily a part of gentrification. Thank you. And then we got told about right to housing. And really quickly, we don't think that the government has a specific duty to defend someone's specific house in a specific area, right? We think it's important for people to have shelter, but just like the government defends people's ability to find employment, they don't defend people's ability to stay in a specific job. We just don't think the principle falls within the debate. We'll weigh all this more explicitly at the end of the presentation. So having said that, on to the first argument of today, the harms of active prevention of gentrification. So the main contention at this point is that measures taken to prevent gentrification are far more harmful than gentrification. So the kinds of measures that state will take to prevent gentrification will involve radical government intervention in urban planning, the very strict rent controls taken in Paris and Berlin that TBSA supports, decline of permission for development. There's 3 impacts that these cause. 1, they encourage landlords to sell their properties because rents are no longer high enough to make a profit. That means house prices decrease because the house prices now flood with properties. And given that someone's house is a really important financial asset, that will really hurt homeowners, both within and out of the gentrifying neighborhood throughout the city. 2, the supply of private rented accommodation will also decrease under this motion because there's now no incentive for people to rent or to develop and use for rental accommodations. So that means, firstly, some affluent people who might want to move into cities aren't able to do so because they're unable to find housing, with serious consequences on civil finances. And even if rents don't increase, when there's more demand for housing, low-income people are more likely to lose out because landlords are more likely to rent to someone with a middle-class background. It's a more secure type of engagement from the landlord. So that will make it harder for low-income people to find places to live, exactly what TBSA is trying to prevent. But 3, even if the amount of private rent accommodation remains the same, it will be of lower quality. So the point at which there are rent caps, landlords are disincentivized from doing anything beyond minimum repairs to their properties, if they cannot ask for higher rents to go along with those improvements. They also have incentive for as many people to one property as possible to get as many rents as they can at that same property. This affects the poorest communities the most and means it forces them to endure poor living standards. So overall, the measures taken to prevent the gentrification are really damaging to neighborhoods and to their residents, and frequently have really severe consequences even to the city more widely. When we weigh this and what we heard from TBSA and displacement, we think these harms that significantly outweigh displacement harms for 3 reasons. Firstly, in terms of this number of people affected,
like number of people affected by city or district-wide rent controls is far higher than people affected by displacement in one specific neighborhood. Two, there's really easy ways to mitigate urban displacement. You'll see alternative housing, but the government can't like artificially restore a house to its original value. Three, renters that are displaced have to stake their finances on where they live, and they're much more flexible, whereas homeowners who sell their house, who see their house values plummet, suffer significantly more. Before we move on to the second argument, I'll leave you on.
Under your own argumentation here, all you're really doing is taking the most marginalized, vulnerable populations and putting them in a house elsewhere. You don't solve the root of these problems.
Okay, so we think like at the point of gentrification, and I'm about to talk about this, and see public services improving, economic area improving. We think people probably want to stay in their area, be more able to stay in their area, because it's easier for them to find employment. Either way, we think like finding alternative housing, having the benefits of the city as a whole, and having investments that you can spend on places, we think it's probably still better than having people stuck in a neighborhood that's not getting any better because we can't get the investment from gentrification. So on to the second argument. The main contention of this argument is that TDSA's mechanism blocks the residents of deprived areas from significant quality of life increases that come from gentrification. So the movement of wealthy people to deprived areas has three main benefits to residents of those areas. So firstly, house prices rise. So as an area becomes more desirable and attracts people, real estate values rise along with house prices. So working class homeowners are now far wealthier because they don't own a house that's potentially worth tens if not hundreds of thousands of euros. They can then choose to sell and use that money to live somewhere nicer than their original neighborhood, but they generally just have more money to spend on what they want, which is quite a good thing. No. Two, public services improve. So gentrifiers are obviously like slightly wealthier than the existing residents of the neighborhood we're moving into, which means there's then a bigger tax base that City Hall can work with to improve services in that area. But also gentrifiers just have more political capital, so local governments tend to be happier to work with or for wealthier, wider demographics, which is what gentrifiers tend to be. So improvements, we get improvements in public services, improvements in high-speed broadband, public transport, the interconnectivity, which is really important for developing communities and help people find employment. But three, economic activity crucially improves. So when gentrifiers move in, new businesses move along with them to take advantage of the disposable income now available in that community. That means there's increased jobs for existing residents, because now new businesses will have to hire clerks or baristas or other low-skilled workers. That's a significant benefit to residents of those communities. And as well, people with more disposable income moving into an area is really good for locally owned businesses, because then they get more footfall. And the money is then reinvested back in the community. This helps keep people within the community, it also just gives them more money, which is quite a good thing. By blocking gentrification in any way, Site Proposition blocks the neighborhood and its residents from financial service-based improvements that they sorely need, a serious consequence for its inhabitants. So, to protect vulnerable residents and to prevent huge and extensive harms to the city as a whole, you must support Team Scotland. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker and call on the second proposition speaker.
It's funny to me that Opposition 1 spends so much time hammering on the one line about rent controls, but miss everything else about our model. We tell you that instead of giving tax credits to foreign businesses, give tax credits to local businesses. Instead of building luxury housing, you build affordable housing. Instead of building a luxury brand new park, you build the basic utilities necessary for these communities. We think they were woefully unresponsive and woefully uncomparative. In my speech, a few things. First, the 3 questions to evaluate this round. What's the comparative? What's better economically? Does the state have an obligation? And then our third substantive argument on culture. What then is the comparative in this round? Opposition wants to say we have to defend a world in which there is no investment into these communities. They warrant this by saying there's no political capital. 2 responses here. First, gentrification isn't the only way to get political capital. Even if wealthy people aren't moving into cities, those cities still have an incentive to improve things like crime and poverty because it hurts the reputation of the entire city. For example, Paris developed socially mixed housing, which was affordable housing that improved the surrounding neighborhood without causing gentrification. In Washington, D.C., $550 million were invested into the poor neighborhood of Berry Farms, looking to upgrade the metro station, create safe walking thoroughfares, and affordable housing to bring opportunity to existing residents. This is investment without gentrification. But then they say there's no funds for this. If that's true, their own model fails too, where they say they want to build affordable housing. They're gonna have to pick one. Then, what's the next question in this debate? What is better for these people economically? What does opposition 1 give you? Basically, they say our model of limitations on supply is bad because it forces landlords to sell. 2 responses here. First, why do these landlords build more supply in the first place? Because they are guaranteed by the government to cash out on those increased profits, meaning it proves to the fact that rents are going to increase. Secondly, we think on our side of the house, the comparative has more supply. The difference is a 50-story building with 50 luxury units versus a 50-story building with 150 affordable housing units. Nextly, we would say you would not need rent controls in the event that gentrification were not occurring because rents would not be rising, meaning all of their harms exist in a world in which gentrification is not actively prevented. Those measures exist when gentrification does. Then they say renters are displaced because landlords are forced to sell because now they have economic incentive to do so. Let's look on the comparative. On their side of the house, every single renter has the incentive to sell because now a luxury developer is going to bid out their profit for more than 3 times of what it is now. At their best case scenario, on our side of the house, maybe 1 or 2 renters sell their property because they no longer see those high margins. Their side is comparatively worse. Then they say there are 2 specific benefits. First is rising housing prices, so people can sell their property. 2 problems here. First, that only benefits people who actually own their property. We say in the vast majority of cases, if they are so economically disadvantaged, they're going to rent because they can't afford things like mortgages and loans. Rather, they just pay month to month. For example, in New York, 70% of people who live in New York rent. Secondly, this doesn't increase value in property taxes, doesn't actually lead to money in people's pockets because it's super liquid. You don't get this money until you cash out and sell your house. Meaning, in order to access their benefits, they have to displace people. Then they say there's going to be different public services. I'll respond to this in a minute. What was our comparable material? Gave you specific analysis as how it will lead to rising rents because landlords can capitalize on luxury people. They said in response that gentrifiers have different demands. Exactly. 1, it exactly proves on this analysis there's going to be an increased cost of living because now there is a new consumer base that businesses can charge more for. Secondly, even if they win political capital, this shows that people just live in separate buildings, meaning all of the political capital goes to fixing the pipes to the new buildings and none of the existing ones. I'll take a point of information on that one.
Once wealthy individuals are discouraged from moving into low-income areas, where do they choose to live instead?
Where they already live in affluent existing areas. We say gentrification is a model in which you encourage wealthy people to move to non-affluent areas. The second question in this debate is there a government obligation? We think opposition pushed this burden on us and severely missed out. Basically, they said, we want to answer the question, basically, they did not respond to UN's analysis in the event that things like eminent domain conflate to state-sponsored eviction. At that point, the process of gentrification is one in which the government is actively promoting the idea that people must be displaced. Moreover, untold you that people have a positive right to a home, which is more than just the affordable shelters they say on their side of the house. Rather, even if you take them with our highest ground, if displacement occurs, people get moved outside of the city that is unresponsive to Un's analysis, where she tells you that a home is more than just 4 walls and a roof, their model. A home is the community in which you live, the ties in which you have, and the people in which you interact with. On that note, I will move into our third substantive argument. Our third substantive argument is that individuals have a right to culture and community control, which necessitates government prevention of gentrification. In local communities, subcultures develop that serve to protect people and give their lives meaning. They rely on key institutions that require local engagement. Think things like churches, school organizations, and cultural organizations. Preservation of these subcultures is essential for 2 key reasons. First, they allow people to care and protect for the most vulnerable people left behind in the state. People use cultural institutions to pool together resources and provide services like free daycare for each other's children, healthcare for the sick and elderly, and a refuge for the homeless. But secondly, and more tangibly, subcultures create political advocacy and political mobilization. In Harlem, for example, churches are safe spaces for Black individuals to organize advocacy against police brutality. Given a history of marginalization that opposition proves, political organization is one of the only ways to protect themselves. Note, this mobilization is the prerequisite to the economic investment that they want on their side of the house. Gentrification destroys subcultures in 2 ways. First is the outright suppression of culture by the majority. Oftentimes, new residents want areas that are safe and clean, so they use the police to downright destroy culture on the basis that it's too noisy. Sulukale, Turkey was the first permanently settled Romani neighborhood. Live entertainment industry was their major source of income, but new, gentrifying residents encouraged the police to stop the music because it was too loud. When the Romani protested, the gentrifiers had the police beat the musicians, destroy their instruments, and abolish the industry as a whole. But secondly, gentrification dilutes the strength of culture. This is uniquely linked to geography, so even if they win affordable housing, this argument still stands. Community organizations get hollowed out as people move to unfamiliar communities, making it impossible to rejoin these cultural institutions. And Bocat is one of the surviving historical enclaves of proud apartheid resistance. That culture is unique to the place in which they reside. The same people that deny this area economic investment see it as ripe for exploitation, proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank our speaker and call on the second up.
Be clear. The cause of gentrification, the desire of people to live in areas with decent accommodation, cannot disappear under the motion, and Team USA recognises. But what we then must face up to is the fact that people fulfill this desire by moving outside of city limits, taking their wealth with them, meaning increased segregation along socioeconomic and income lines in major cities. That is a world that we in Team Scotland refuse to live on. The flaw that Team USA have made so far in their debate is that they wanted to fight the debate on opposing active support of gentrification by governments. But that's not their burden. Their burden in this debate is to show you why active prevention of gentrification outweighs all of the harms that we bring you in our side of the house. And that flaw runs through the entirety of their case, which I will respond to now. First of all, in response to our material, they point out, they say that it's not just rent controls and that subsidies, removal of them also applies. We tell you that we think those harms that we bring you in vendettas first very much still apply. And we think that actually in order to actively prevent gentrification in a lot of cases, rent control is what is going to be required to be enacted. Now moving on to the main claims that we get from their side of the house. The first claim is broadly about the idea of displacement. First of all, we tell you that it's not our burden to say that we have to support things like illegal evictions. We can very much stand and support the value of rights for tenants, and we think that things like illegal evictions are not our burden to support on this debate today. Secondly, this idea of people being driven out. We tell you that actually homeowners are a specific group that is less likely to be driven out. We tell you that actually the response that we get in terms of homeowners is just that there aren't very many low-income communities. No, thank you. We think that actually across the EU, when 70% of general households own their home, we think that it's not fair for Team USA to just assert that people in low-income communities don't own their homes. We think that actually in lower-income tight-knit communities, often homes can be passed down through generations. We think that actually this is a feature of many areas like in New York where apartments are often passed down through families. They don't give you any justification for this. They just assert that because homes are expensive and people don't have incomes, they therefore do not own homes. We actually tell you that under the status quo as well, displacement does already occur for other reasons, because of crime or because of poor quality housing. It's not necessarily a unique benefit, a unique harm because of gentrification. No, thank you. But then, even if we do get displacement, we weigh this against the long-term benefits actually. We think that in the long term, private investors, when they're allowed to undergo the process of gentrification, they're more likely to take a risk on affordable housing. They've managed to build up a safe network of housing in a low-income community already. They know that's a worthwhile investment, so they're more likely to take a risk on affordable housing. We think actually for the people who are not displaced, all the benefits that Benedetta brings you in her first speech still very much stand and benefit those people there. Then on this idea, this claim that we get that businesses will move away and be replaced by other ones. We think that first of all, they're not necessarily displaced because it's very much a different market. We think that the Whole Foods coming in to cater to the new middle class people will still exist, but most people will still buy their milk or their cigarettes from a corner shop or from a bodega. We don't think that necessarily they're replacing what is already there. We think that actually what they're doing is enhancing and adding more services rather than stripping out the ones that are there. We think that actually, secondly, these new businesses that come out are likely to be better. We're more likely to see banks moving into areas of low income, meaning that source of financial credit is available for people. There's more opportunities for employment when there's now lots of firms wanting to hire clerks and people to work in the front of their stores. Yes, please.
Whenever Walmart moves into a gentrifying area, not only do they displace the local community businesses like for milk and bread and things of that nature, but they also pay their employees like sub-living minimum wages.
Okay, we don't think that that is necessarily true. Like I've just said, we think that in many areas, local businesses will still survive, especially when there's a community fighting to protect them there. And we think that actually, if there's not employment already available, we'd rather have somebody working at Walmart than not working there at all. But we think that actually, when you weigh this long term, we think that when house prices are falling, when standards of living are falling, we think that actually that's a situation, if we vote the side proposition, where more basic services will be, because there's no economic activity in an area. So we tell you that actually we win on that point as well. Then they bring us this place that the government has a duty to intervene. We think that this very much relies on the practicalities. They have to show you that because of their motion, they get better quality housing and they get a better quality of life. And since we've shown you why that is not true, we've given you analysis as to the contrary, we think that their principle doesn't really stand and isn't really relevant because it relies completely on these practicalities. They then bring us this idea about culture, which we have a few responses to. First of all, we think in areas where there's a really strong community, they're most likely to benefit from gentrification. There's more likely to be home ownership or small businesses being passed down. We think that landlords are more likely to be part of the community, so wanting to make sure that they're still accessible. I think there's more likely to be a support network there for these new businesses coming in. And we tell you that even if, there is some cultural disruption, we think that is massively outweighed by the benefits of better services and more money coming in. We then get this idea of like calling the police and there's more increased discrimination. First of all, we think because of the types of people moving into these areas, they're often young millennials and professionals. We don't think these are necessarily the type of people who hold these discriminatory views. And we think that actually, as I'm going to move on to talk about, we get less segregation on our side of the house. So, Team USA accepted in a POI that people still want to live in nice areas, that they still have this desire. But actually, when there's no longer the option of living in inner cities, in areas that are gentrified, they instead move out to the suburbs of cities, which means that you get divides. You get people living out with cities and suburbs who are richer, and you get people living in the inside who are much poorer. We think this has a few major impacts. Firstly, in terms of the social impacts, it leads to this increased stereotyping and stigma, because those living in suburbs are not exposed to these diverse communities. So they're relying on their own ideas and the media perception of these others. And this is split along income lines, but also ethnic lines, as those from ethnic minorities are more likely to live in these poorer areas. This has two major impacts. First of all, those in suburbs then use these stereotypes to inform their ideology of decision making. It informs the way they vote, it informs who they hire, it informs where they send their children to school. Yes, please.
What is more important, stereotyping certain individuals or having a quality of life where you're not displaced and forced to live in a community that you did not grow up in?
We think that the harms of individuals being stereotyped are absolutely massive, because when these people who are forming these stereotypes due to their incomes are more likely to be in positions of power and decision making, and they're the ones who decide about policies in the city, we think is extremely harmful when their perception comes from these stereotypes. We think that's what leads to policies of over-policing certain areas when you do not interact with those people. Secondly, we think it also perpetuates the narrative of certain areas being run down or dangerous. We get less private investment into these areas because they're seen as high risk. We get less footfall of people going into these areas, and we don't think that is an area which is particularly good to live in. But furthermore, we also get severe economic impacts from this. When tax revenue moves outside of city boundaries into these suburbs, that means there's less revenue for city halls to invest back in. And when cities' budgets are squeezed, the ones who lose out the most are those on low incomes, because they do not have the political capital to complain about the fact that they have less services, which is worse for lower income residents, which is exactly what Team USA wants to prevent. But even if this wealth can be absorbed, wealthy suburbs are narrowly focused on their own issues because they're so separate, so they're more likely to lobby for lower taxes. And if they do lobby for public services, these are not the ones that benefit low-income communities. They're not going to lobby for better public transport when they drive. So what this means, because of these economic impacts, that even if this motion does effectively prevent the process of gentrification, the government has a reduced ability to actually help those in low-income communities, because its income is reduced, because it has moved out with city boundaries, or because those outside city boundaries do not want that going towards people in low incomes. Preventing the process of gentrification, when it creates these more saturated cities, is extremely harmful and something we cannot stand for, very proud to oppose.
Speaker and call on the third opposition speaker.
It's important to bring some clarity to what side opposition is truly telling you when they suggest certain elements of gentrification to help marginalized communities. Economically speaking, they rely on corporations that have a history of shutting out marginalized populations and leaving them in substandard working conditions to be able to provide them with higher wages and more employment. Politically, they rely on affluent individuals who vote in politicians that uniquely provide policies that harm those marginalized communities and create racist tendencies that ultimately harm them in the long term to be these same individuals that are now your neighbor. They tell you socially that it's okay to sacrifice certain elements of your culture, that it's okay to believe that simply nothing truly will affect you if you choose to accept that there are certain economic benefits that truly outweigh. We think these types of logic are the same things that increase the amount of root-like problems that come from complex areas that harm marginalized communities. Note, our side of the house is not one that says deny these individuals any form of investment. We say just don't put a band-aid over a bullet hole for a very, very serious situation. In this speech, I'll be doing a few things. First, I'm going to respond directly to side opposition's third argument before moving on to discussing two key questions that help summarize today's debate. First, does gentrification create displacement? And the second does, how does gentrification affect community culture? But on to our first substantive, which is our opposition's third substantive, which is how gentrification creates safe spaces for these individuals because now they're decreasing the amount of stereotypes that happens here. A few lines of rebuttal. We'd say first, this entire argument is predicated on the assumption that the people who are ultimately marginalized, the most vulnerable, actually are able to stay within these communities. This argument does not access and it cannot be accessed because they fail to truly engage with the fact that displacement uniquely happens in a world where you allow for gentrification to occur. That really means that truly these stereotypes will continue to occur because all that changed is that there's now an affluent individual living in a once marginalized population. The second is that it actually worsens these elements of cultures and stereotypes on their side of the house. Why is this the case? Because it's unique to how gentrification operates. If it's true on their side of the house that individuals have this desire to be surrounded by culture, the thing that happens is not me trying to sit down with my neighbor and truly understand the background and the history of their race or where their economic background came from, but rather just tokenizing certain elements of their culture. So look to what happens in Harlem, New York, where in new niche coffee shops there's pictures of black art, but I sort of a large amount of police crackdown because those individuals still believe those stereotypes but want to tokenize that culture for the benefits that come from it. We don't think that this is a true engagement with benefits that come from the benefits of gentrification. Now on to the first question in today's debate. What does gentrification create displacement? Note, it's not enough for opposition to get up here and say that, well, it's just simply not our burden to support illegal things. Because under the world of gentrification, when you're not actively preventing it under a government, all of the elements that encourage displacement to happen for marginalized communities is legal. This happens on your side of the house. It was a rather dismissive response for them to do that. But in fact, we've carried down the bench a lot of analysis as to why this isn't true. Just empirically speaking, it's 2 times more likely that individuals will be displaced in a gentrified area than in one that is not. But even if you don't want to buy into statistics or studies, there's 2 mechanisms that were very, very boldly unaddressed by side opposition. First was on rising rents. Note this engages with the stakeholders that make up the majority of individuals within gentrifying communities. When they say that, oh, a lot of people own homes in New York, they're actually not truly giving you analysis here. Because in New York City, 70% of the population lives in rented communities. That means that when my rent increases, I'm uniquely to be at harm because of gentrification. There's no way to offset the cost of increased rents for luxury apartments. Why is this the case? 2 crucial characterizations that need to be engaged in. The first is that gentrification is a very, very rapid process, which means that the increase of my rent, the increase in prices at the stores around me, happen immediately. But my ability to find a job, even in their best case scenario, happens gradually. So I still am shut out because I have no ability to be able to offset these types of costs. But secondly, under a characterization of employment, where they literally say verbatim, it's much, much easier to find employment. But that's an assertion at best. We tell you we need to question what the quality of that employment truly is. It's oftentimes at very, very big corporations that have a plethora of resources to be able to tell you the same narrative that you're replaceable. That means that you get things like part-time loopholes, bad hours, poor treatment, and no ability to be able to maintain a sustainable form of life. We say prefer local businesses. These get shut out when big corporations come in because they simply cannot compete. But local businesses reinvest within their community when they aren't threatened by gentrification, something that corporations uniquely do not do. Moreover, they do ensure that there's higher wages because there's that cultural connection and understanding of the community that they are tied to. Second mechanism is the cost of living, which engages with their discussion of homeowners. At their best, I sell my home for a price that was once a little bit higher than what I bought it for. But I don't get any of the benefits that they talk about where I have this extra revenue to be able to better my life. No, because now the money that I made from that home has to go to 1, buying a new home, enduring moving costs, commuting to a job that was once 5 minutes away from me, or looking for some sort of life support because the recreation babysat my kids say, is now gone for a new niche coffee shop. These are all the harms that offset any form of being able to maintain a sustainable form of life. Before I get into why this matters, though.
Why don't low-income small business owners benefit from a larger number of wealthier customers?
We say they oftentimes don't because those affluent individuals would rather shop at a Whole Foods than some mom and pop shop. The community that was once residing there, the marginalized and vulnerable, recognize the importance of a mom and pop shop rather than the individuals that simply choose to move in and want to go to whatever they were once accustomed to from their life of privilege. We think, moreover, the reason why this argument is so important and why this matters so much in today's debate is because if you buy into any of the economic benefits that come from side opposition side of the House, it's inaccessible to the people that need it the most. Second question in today's debate is how does gentrification affect community culture? Note, even if you don't buy anything that I spent the entirety of this debate talking about when it comes to displacement, this is a unique reasoning as to why we can still win for why governments need to actively prevent gentrification. Let's expand upon what was given to you in our third substantive because it didn't get quite enough engagement. Who told you that the strength of culture is uniquely weakened when populations are now dispersed or placed in communities where they're unable to truly be able to be recognized? We think our side of the House would tell you that it doesn't get better for individuals because they're now homeowners. That's a faulty assumption. And it's oftentimes the affluent individuals that continue to create very, very problematic policies for these individuals. Those were not substantial amounts of analysis. Here's why this will matter over all of the economic benefits that they told you as to why this weighs out. We tell you that culture is built around the location uniquely. When it comes to public health issues in my community, I rely on the culture and the community that's residing in it to be able to better it. I rely on the historical landmarks that looks like the Seleuke in Turkey or for Harlem in New York. We think these individuals ultimately rely on the place that they reside in to be able to benefit themselves. They rely on the ability of having the people that were once in that community to be able to better them. Culture can never be brought back together once it's completely dispersed or destroyed. Economies can always bounce back. That's why you prefer our side of the House. Very proud to propose.
Thank that speaker and call on the opposition third speaker.
I think the reason Team USA lost this debate is that they refused to actually have it. Because at the point at which they tell you in the first minute of their speech that gentrification is as a result of wealthy individuals moving into a community with their incomes, actively preventing gentrification means turning off that inflow. When the third speaker tells you that economies can just bounce back, all of a sudden they fail to understand the true ramifications of the drastic measures they need to implement, and they shirk their burden massively. 2 points of clash in this debate. Firstly, on economic opportunity, where no debate is realistically won or lost. Secondly, on principles and community, which I'm probably going to deal with much more briefly. So firstly, on economic opportunity, on what side of the house are people living in gentrified neighborhoods better off? Because we told you you don't get investment without gentrification. Firstly, you just don't get political capital on behalf of the cities, because you don't have residents lobbying their local governments. But secondly, and the much more impactful strand of that analysis, you don't get the private sector investment from all of those people, all of those companies, Walmart, the property developers, those evil corporations that come in to actually provide it. They're only responsible for this in their next tell us that, oh, well, Washington, D.C. and Paris managed to provide millions of investment for certain communities in town. What did he do? Really liberal cities in Europe were able to provide large amounts of public sector investment. So cities that are undergoing, by the way, quite a lot of gentrification in those sorts of limited circumstances. I think we can always just get it more on our side of the house. and note that when you have tax revenue as a result of gentrification, you're better placed to do it. But also they don't engage with the private sector investment, that you can't just have the government permanently bankrolling every house in a gentrified neighbourhood. You need some private landlords who are willing to rent, you're going to need some people going in to provide some of that revenue. You don't get that when you specifically say that these neighbourhoods are only going to be for residents on low incomes. If I'm a company, I'm not going to move into an area primarily inhabited by people on low incomes. That discourages investment patently. That means you don't get those beneficial economic effects. Also note that if you don't have that level of investment, the situation only gets worse, because once the situation is not that good, it's more affluent residents within the gentrified communities, so local residents, start to move out, meaning that more money starts to leave and that neighbourhood spirals downwards, meaning that you get a really terrible economic situation. Again, I don't think they ever truly grasp that. Secondly, now let's look at their analysis on displacement and rent. And they tell us that means you get increased demand for rent, which means rent rise much higher, and that means that people are forced out. 4 responses. Firstly, we refuse to let Team USA put us in a box here. We tell you we don't necessarily have to support the worst landlords on the planet and the worst planning laws on the planet, and that we can probably support some kinds of tenants' rights, some kinds of housing association benefits, some kinds of housing subsidies on our side of the house. But secondly, we think the harm can be mitigated massively when you consider that those rental markets are not necessarily homogenous. The same kinds of people, the kinds of people that are going into gentrify neighbourhoods, are not necessarily the kinds of people who currently live there, but often you're developing empty lots, you're not necessarily into a 1-for-1 ratio there. But thirdly, displacement occurs much more on their side of the house. Because what happens when landlords know that they are going to get much less rent is that they sell their properties because they're not providing the same source of income they have. Even if rent is just kept low as a result of there only being low-income residents in those communities, that means that you have a reduced housing stock. That means that you have much more evictions on behalf of landlords trying to get people out, because instead of trying to rent it to a more high-income owner, they just want to sell it. But also, you get much worse maintenance of those properties. You're probably not going to have the heating look after. You're probably going to have people pushed much more into a room. Your community is starting to break down, even in their best-case scenario. What was their response to our rental stock analysis? They told us that we only mentioned rent controls. Firstly, we didn't. We told you that the same analysis applies at the point at which any policy means that you're not expecting to receive a lower rental income. If you're trying to prevent rents from rising, you have a policy which prevents rents from rising, I as an income definitionally will receive, definitionally will receive less rent as a result of that. But also, we think they shirk their burden when we refuse to defend rent controls. If you look at any city that tried to prevent gentrification, Paris, Berlin, they've had to implement rent control as a method of realistically preventing gentrification. Yet another example of Team USA refusing to have the actual debates. Okay, but then what about the idea of undermining local businesses? So you get different clientele that these new businesses displace them and are not useful for local residents. Four responses to this. Firstly, we don't think that businesses that don't serve multiple kinds of consumers at once. We just challenge their analysis that all these people moving into gentrified neighbourhoods. So they might be moving into a Turkish area of Berlin, right, because they kind of like the character of that community, maybe want to go to the local Turkish corner store that's helped by milk and cigarettes, right? That means you probably have some degree of mutual overlap, which you don't get quite the same extent of gentrification. But also, we don't think all the new businesses that move in are entirely useless to the residents, right? If you have a bank or a post office or any of those other kinds of things, that's probably quite good for you as a resident, even if you're on a low income, you're still able to use that. Thirdly, we think you have displacement without I'll take you a minute. Thirdly, we think you have displacement without gentrification on their side, at the point at which those businesses start to leave because income residents are starting to leave because of the stagnation in that community. Fourthly, even in their worst case scenario, you still get employment, right? Even if Walmart moves in, that's still more jobs in that community than were there under the status quo compared to stagnation. We'll happily defend that as a preferable economic model to approach stagnation. I'll take it to your eye.
You refuse to engage with our analysis about displacement. Sure, banks are useful, that doesn't matter if the people who live in that community were displaced.
I think that I engaged with the analysis about displacement where I told you that you get much more displacement when you integrate a really disastrous policy that as a result means that landlords sell all their housing stock and force people into a small number of homes, meaning you get much more evictions. We also think that probably we're willing to accept a degree of displacement if that means you have much more economic opportunities in the city in general. And thirdly, let's look at lastly on this point of patch, let's look at Katrina's analysis here, which tells you about people moving outside of cities. because they conceded in a POI that people move to existing affluent areas. Their only response was to say that, well, like the same stereotyping analysis doesn't really happen because people move in and they don't interact with each other. Firstly, we don't think their response to the stereotyping analysis is sufficient to the point to which they don't really engage with the fact that the kinds of cities that tend to be more integrated tend to have better racial relations, or the fact that you're specifically labelling this as a no-go area by putting it in a protected status by the government. But also, they never responded to the biggest impact of this point, which is that when wealthy people move out of city limits, they no longer contribute taxes to City Hall, and that government is less able to provide basic services to those low-income communities. When they live in cities entirely divorced from those kinds of communities, that means they vote for policies in their local elections which actively hurt those kind of individuals. We asked how great it was to live as a low-income resident in New York in 1975, when the city filed for bankruptcy and had to double subway fares overnight. We don't think they adequately engaged. The end strategic impact of this is that we said that low-income residents are much better off. Okay, principles and communities. I think basically both of these points are exactly the same insofar as there is a right to a home or some kind of community impact which is worth preserving, and therefore the government has a duty to step in and preserve it. Firstly, I've lumped these together because they're both entirely common principles, contingent to the point to which they actually manage to show those things analytically. So no, you can't win them entirely as that separate points of clash. But secondly, we think you protect those communities more. Why? Because you don't get the kinds of displacement that occur on their side of the house, which we think are much worse because it means those communities are ripped out as a result of economic inability. We think the communities are better placed to benefit at the point at which they have more customers in there, which is able to help them. We also think it just doesn't matter as much in comparison to the major economic harm. For those reasons, oppose.
Speak and call on the opposition apply to close off their case.
TUSA couldn't win today's debate by listing the negative consequences of gentrification or telling us why the government shouldn't actively support it. They lost this debate because they did not meet their burden of justifying why the benefits of actively preventing gentrification outweigh the harms that we brought you onto Scotland. Two questions in this debate. Does gentrification help or harm local residents, and how does gentrification affect those in housing and culture? The first key clash was within housing. We got this idea from TUSA, like displacement, the eviction cost of living, to which we told you that homeowners that can stay and they gain massively from house prices rising. We told you that lots of people will stay at the point at which gentrification leads to services getting better, and leads to those communities having more money, being more linked to other places. But we also told you to weigh the harms of gentrification, with the huge costs of gentrification and investment being prevented from entering the city at all. The much worse public services that result from City Hall no longer having that money to spend. How much harder it is for low-income people to be connected to the point at which Team USA's mechanism is implemented. On this point of clash, we told you that rent capture and other anti-gentrification methods send low-income homeowners into foreclosure. They make it so difficult for low-income people to find housing at all. And even if they do manage, it's so much worse because landlords no longer have the incentive to maintain those houses, to keep them at an acceptable standard, because there's no longer that profit incentive because Team USA supports rent caps. We also told you on this point that anti-gentrification methods lead to low-income people being completely blocked from the benefits of gentrification, such as more jobs, such as better public services, things that they need to get to work, things like better economic activity in their area. This is crucially important, and this was where we want the debate. On the second point of clash though, so how does gentrification affect relations between like housing and cultural groups? So we got this idea from Team USA of like gentrification breaking up into like cultural groups, the effect that has on sense of identity. They link this to like some group government too. Okay, we told you that the stronger the identity in a community, the less likely it is to be gentrified. Because landlords are probably going to like keep renting to people of like their community. You're going to want to keep that alive, right? We think we probably get gentrification in areas where actually the community links aren't very strong, and it's like more flexibility in terms of more influx in terms of who comes and goes from that community. But then crucially, we told you that like gentrifying areas and just like preventing ethnic mixing of them increases the severity of racial discrimination, which like Team USA is so keen to fight, by making them no-go zone, by making them like by increasing the perception to other people that they're like dangerous, they shouldn't go there. We think that's incredibly harmful. It accentuates the problem that Team USA is trying to solve. And then crucially on this point, we told you that like rich people moving out of cities leads to increased stereotyping of BNA areas. Things that have really tangible, like important effects, like policy making, that directly harms like low-income neighborhoods. We also told you, there was very little response to this, that taking money out of the city hall jurisdiction means the city cannot reinvest that money into the private areas. They cannot link up low-income communities to like other parts of the city. They can't like improve public service. They can't improve education. They can't like solve public transport crisis, right? Because the money has now left. It's only really one side in this debate today which actually increases economic activity in gentrifying areas. It's only really one side that actually helps London residents get to work, have decent housing, have housing at all really. And it's only really one side that sees these areas improve in the long term, not just in the immediate term. That side is Team Scotland. That's why you must go to this. Thank you.
Reply to close off the debate in the first round of WSDC 2019.
Whoop-de-doo, opposition bloc? Say whoop-de-doo to the thousands of people in Berry Farms, Washington, D.C. who weren't displaced because they followed our model. Say whoop-de-doo to the thousands of people in Paris who had socially mixed affordable housing because they followed our model. You might have forgotten after the 12 minutes of the opposition bloc because they framed this debate as, let's build roads where roads don't exist. No, we're talking about Harlem. Harlem has roads and banks. The question of this debate is whether or not Harlem needs rich white people to buy out their churches. That's what this debate was about. Two questions. What is Proposition's best material and why is it insufficient? Why then, and the second question is why then is displacement the thing to care about in this round? First question, what is Proposition's best material, why is it insufficient? This is as charitable as possible, assuming displacement doesn't occur. Firstly, they told you that decreased rents through anti-gentrification policies encourage landlords to sell, displacing people. We gave you two responses, neither of which went responded to. First, remember the comparative. On their side of the house, every landlord wants to sell their property because luxury real estate developers are offering to sell it for 3 times what they're currently making. At worst, some landlords on our side of the house no longer make the necessary profit. We think on the comparative we're better. Second, we told you the only reason you would need rent controls is when rents rise due to gentrification. Second big idea they gave you is that, oh, well, people can live in affordable housing so displacement won't occur. I mean, fine, you're not hopeless, but it still feeds the majority of harms in our case. First, we told you that cultural organizations are linked to the place that it exists. For example, we gave you BOPAP in Cape Town, South Africa, meaning the political mobilization that instigates the consolidated, motivated political blocs that you need to see economic investment disappear on their side of the house. Secondly, it proves their burden that they pushed on us about the government obligation to actively prevent. Because the point in which you move people out of their home and just to a house, you violated a right. The government obviously has an obligation to prevent the violation of rights. The last offense they gave you is now big box stores move in, and that is good. We told you that is true, but local businesses get out-competed, but they are so much better. First, because local businesses reinvest in these communities because they're owned by people in the community who want to profit back. They spend their profits on other stores. And secondly, we told you, it leads to the better treatment of workers. Why? Because when Walmart comes in, Walmart doesn't care who lives there. Walmart cares about exploiting as much profit from the community as possible. But a local mom and pop store sees their neighbor walk in and apply for a job. They want to give them the best wages that they possibly can and still make a profit. I think the comparative is very clear. Why then is displacement the thing to care about most in this round? Even if some people accrue marginal economic benefits who stay, it doesn't outweigh the devastation of displacement for thousands of people. I don't care if my toothpaste is $2 cheaper if I no longer have a home over my head. The crucial flaw of opposition's case is that the new people who move in have different demands. If that's true, it proves the cost of living's increased because there's new demands, and it proves the political capital will be used to crack down on cultures because these people have different demands. It proves that political capital will only be used to help the new buildings. And no, opposition, you cannot just find a new home. Because I'm a poor individual, it's very hard for me to put down the security deposit, put down first and last month's rent. I don't understand if in their best case scenario, people are so poor they don't have roads, how they're going to afford to pay to find a new home. It's so clear. You should vote for the proposition.